All right, the final session is going to try to connect the discussion of identifiable victim effects to broader issues in contemporary ethics. And specifically, we're thinking about two topics. One is the question to what degree our obligations are towards specific persons, to what degree our obligations are for some people in particular. The other one is about the relation of the discussion of that bias to the different schools of thought in contemporary ethics. And we have, to use a very broad and very crude brush, which people never like, three speakers, very distinguished with sort of philosophical preferences that sort of overlap with the schools Neo-Kantianism, virtue ethics, and consequentialism. So I hope that this will enlighten us as to the broader issues that this connects to in contemporary ethics. Our first speaker will be Steve Darwall. Professor Darwall is the Andrew Downey Orrick Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. Darwall's work in recent years has focused on what he calls second personal ethics, which is closely related to the topics that we're discussing here. Usually, second person obligations are framed in the context of certainty, so it would be very interesting to hear how he thinks issues of risk to identified people, bear on his framework, or what his framework has to say on this. Before Darwall became Mr. Second Personal Obligations, he was Mr. Respect for Persons. He was also Mr. Joseph Butler and other 17th and 18th century British philosophers, moralists. He's published a number of books and edited volumes, including article collections that are broadly used in teaching. I'm sure those of you who teach philosophy have used them many times. He has two forthcoming Oxford University Press volumes on so-called essays in second personal ethics. One is titled Morality, Authority, and Law, and the other Honor, History, and Relationship. Darwall, a former president of the Central Division of the APA, the American Philosophical Association, is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Please join me in welcoming.
Well, thanks, Nir. And maybe as the first speaker in the last session, I might, on behalf of all the speakers in the sessions, thank Nir and Norm and Steve and Glenn, yes, and everyone else who is involved in organizing this wonderful conference. It's been a very interesting conference. So it might be interesting if I had something to say about how a second person standpoint affects chancy situations. And actually, as I've thought more and more over these last 2 days, it's occurred to me that exactly how we understand identified individuals versus statistical lives is an interesting question, and it seems to be relative to a policy situation or an act situation. I'm not so much going to talk about the relevance of that distinction in particular. I want to talk about how a certain kind of approach in moral philosophy, and this is sort of in the same vein that Arthur Applebaum was gesturing to at the end of the last session, might approach cases where you're in a position to harm or to benefit someone who is an identified individual, but also this is at the cost of foregoing more benefits or saving more lives, and where the relevant situation or the relevant framework is one where we're thinking of all of us as agents interacting, and all of us as accountable to one another. So Nir talked about what he called second personal obligations, sometimes called relational obligations or duties, directed obligations or duties, bipolar obligations. These are obligations that are to specific individuals or groups of individuals. they're second personal in the sense that they're owed to someone. They have an obligee. There's the obligor and there's the obligee, or the obligees. And this is contrasted with what we might call moral obligation, period. Now, I want to argue that actually both are second personal in an important philosophical way. So there's second personal genus, but there are different species of this genus. And then I want to draw some consequences from this about how to think about these kinds of issues. So again, bipolar obligations, for example, the obligation one undertakes to a promisee when one makes a promise, they have an obligor-obligee structure. And they entail a correlative claim right on behalf of the obligee held against the obligor. And the important point for my purposes is they entail what I think of as the obligee's individual authority to make claims against the obligor and hold the obligor personally accountable. And what's going to figure in this talk is what we might think of as a Strawsonian analysis of accountability. This is P.F. Strawson in the very famous article, Freedom and Resentment. The crucial aspects of accountability, as Strawson analyzes it in that article, is that accountability is always implicitly, I say second personal, he says interpersonal, and he talks about a distinctive standpoint or way of viewing people that we employ when we hold them accountable, a participant perspective as opposed to an objective perspective. The participant perspective isn't necessarily a perspective of someone who's in the situation participating in the action that's being judged. It's someone who's in a position to relate to the object of the attitude. And he coined this term reactive attitude to refer to a set of perfectly familiar attitudes, resentment, indignation, moral blame, gratitude, guilt, not shame, though he says shame, but I think I can show that it's not shame for interesting reasons. And what's important about these attitudes is they have a distinctive structure, a distinctive interpersonal or second personal structure, because they always implicitly make a demand of their objects. And to make a demand, even in thought, is to address it. So their objects are always their implicit addressees. But they don't make mere demands. They're not simply attempting to impose the will of the person who has the attitude on the person who's the object of the attitude. Rather, they make a putatively legitimate demand. And in making a putatively legitimate demand, they, of course, presuppose the authority to make that demand. And they bid for the other's recognition of that authority. So they come, as I like to put it, with an RSVP, right? So generally when I give talks around this kind of topic, I have a couple of slides I put up here of some ice dancers, Maurizio Margoglio and Barbara Fusar-Poli, and this is in the Winter Olympics, not the most recent one, but the one before. They're dancing for the medal, ice dancing, and they get within a minute of the end of the program, and Maurizio Margoglio drops Barbara Fusar-Poli, and they get up from the ice, and Barbara Fusar-Poli has a reactive attitude. She looks Maurizio right in the eye, and you know, you can see the look, you'd know it. You probably just by description you know it. The caption of the image in the internet was Barbara Fusar-Poli to Maurizio Margoglio, "Look me in the eye and tell me how you dropped me." So she's holding him answerable. She's holding him accountable. And so she's making a kind of an implicit demand on him, but not just a naked demand, a putatively legitimate one, and she's wanting him to reciprocate her attitude. And were he to do so, he'd reciprocate it with the reciprocal attitude of guilt. Guilt is the attitude that acknowledges the authority that one has violated and holds oneself responsible in a way that reciprocates the others holding one responsible. Okay, so that's what I mean by the second personal structure of reactive attitudes. Second personal here has a grammatical or a logical sense. It doesn't mean literally a second person, a second party. So I distinguish between second party and second personal. Guilt is a second personal attitude because it involves a kind of self-blame, the address of oneself by oneself, not as if from one's own perspective, but as I think of it, as if from anyone's perspective. Okay, so if we read this back into bipolar obligations involve the idea that the obligee has an individual authority to hold the obligor responsible or accountable. And so if there is a genuine bipolar obligation, then the obligor is fittingly the object of a personal reactive attitude like resentment. Sorry, did I miss something here? Maybe I didn't. Okay. Yeah, I did. Yeah. So bipolar obligations involve the obligee's individual authority. This is an authority that's discretionary, right? So this came up actually in some of Glenn's remarks about tort law. In torts, it's a bipolar obligation that's been putatively violated. There's been an injury to a victim, to a putative victim. But who's in a position to bring the action? Only the victim. It's up to the victim to decide whether or not to seek compensation, just as it's up to the victim before the putative violation to decide whether or not to consent to what would otherwise be a violation. It's up to the victim to decide whether or not to forgive in the case that there is a violation. No one else has standing to do that. So it's part of the very idea, I claim, of bipolar obligations or directed or relational duties that the obligee has this individual authority to hold the obligor personally accountable. That's its conceptual structure, if you like. With what we might think of as moral obligation, period, that is just the fact of being morally obligated, whether or not it's to someone or other. That is, it's being the case that were you to fail to act in a certain way, you would do moral wrong, okay? There's not necessarily an obligee-obligor structure. But my view is it's also second personal. Why? Because it's a conceptual truth that if something is a moral obligation, then it's an action of a kind such that were one to perform it without excuse, one would be fittingly the object of an impersonal reactive attitude like moral blame. That is not one that's distinctively from the victim's point of view, but one that's, as it were, from anyone's point of view. So blame doesn't involve a presupposition of any individual authority, but it does involve a presupposition of what I would call representative authority. Authority of a representative member of the moral community or representative person. When I feel guilt and blame myself, I'm making a demand of myself, but not just as from the victim's point of view, because I might do that. I might just think, well, it's justified from the victim's point of view, but not think I'm really culpable. If I'm feeling guilt, I'm feeling that what I did was culpable. So I must think that there's a demand that I'm literally making of myself, but as if from anyone's perspective, as if from the perspective of a member of the moral community. So I think it's a conceptual truth, and I argue for this in my book, The Second Person Standpoint, that if X is a moral obligation, if and only if failure to do X without excuse would be blameworthy. So notice there's a difference between the context of being wrong and being blameworthy, because something could be wrong but not blameworthy because you had an excuse. But these three concepts are linked. Okay. So if on this view of the nature of moral obligations, period, and moral obligations, too, directed or relational obligations, they'll both be second personal, but in somewhat different ways. And I think there's a connection between these because, again, I think it's a conceptual truth that if you violate a moral obligation to someone, then what you do is wrong, period, other things being equal. I mean, there might be something else that justifies it, but if there isn't, then what you do is wrong, period. And that's not a substantive normative thesis that you get from some substantive normative theory. That's just a conceptual truth about the nature of moral obligation and obligations too. So bipolar obligations in their nature entail personal accountability and individual authority, and moral obligations, period, that is, whether or not they're to someone, entail impersonal, that is, third party, but nonetheless second personal accountability and representative authority. Now, I really just want to make a couple of fairly simple points, conceptual points today. One is to show that it doesn't follow from a very plausible view about the irrationality of preferring that fewer statistical lives be saved when to do so would mean that we have to, sorry, I'm not going to get this right. It's irrational to prefer that fewer statistical lives be saved. That it just doesn't follow from that directly what it would be morally right or morally wrong for anyone to do. I mean, we could have a view that connects these, but we'd have to connect it through the concepts with the relevant structure. So let's assume that it's irrational to prefer, from an impartial or moral point of view, that fewer lives be saved or that less benefit result, even if that's necessary to benefit or forbear costs to identified individuals. If that's true, that's a claim about the good. That's a claim about what's desirable from the moral point of view, or preferable from the moral point of view. And we can just stipulate that that's true. First point is just that it doesn't follow from that, this claim about the good, that it's morally obligatory to act on this preference, or that it doesn't follow that it's true that it would, because for that to be true, it would have to be blameworthy to fail to do so, lacking excuse. So if it's morally obligatory to fail to act on that preference, then given this analysis of moral obligation, it would have to be blameworthy to fail to act on that preference were you to do so without excuse. It doesn't even follow that it's morally permissible to do so. And so it doesn't follow that there's most moral reason to act on that preference, since that may be wrong. Now, I think there's a kind of interesting point here in the background. John Stuart Mill, in Chapter 5 of Utilitarianism, famously says, "We do not call an action wrong unless we think it's an action that someone would be appropriately punished for, if not by law, then by the opinion of others, if not by the opinion of others, then at least by the reproaches of his own conscience." Roughly, it's a conceptual truth that if an action is wrong, it's blameworthy, lacking excuse. It's interesting that in that chapter, Mill goes on to say some things about rules and practices, and most people end up thinking that, at least in that chapter, Mill is, if not himself espousing, is certainly getting very close to something like rule utilitarianism as opposed to act utilitarianism. So this is where he's talking about justice and rights, and he's talking about, you know, the biggest objection to utilitarianism comes from those who think that it conflicts with justice, but we can give justice a utilitarian basis, not in an act utilitarian way, but in a rule utilitarian way. And it's interesting that Derek Parfit, who in Reasons and Persons was as insightful and resourceful a defender of act consequentialism as may have existed on the planet, now has published a book, or 2 volumes, on What Matters, in which he defends rule consequentialism as opposed to act consequentialism. And it's a good, interesting question, what changed Parfit's mind about this? In fact, it's not just that he defends rule consequentialism opposed to act consequentialism. He now says that act consequentialism is not so much, or is, I think to be careful, is perhaps best viewed not so much as a rival theory of moral right and wrong as a rival to morality, as a theory of impersonal reasons, as a theory of what it makes sense to do from the impersonal point of view. And I think basically when you read the chapter in which he writes that, you'll see that what Parfit thinks is that it's a conceptual truth that if an action is wrong, then it's blameworthy, lacking excuse. He distinguishes between what he calls the blameworthy sense of wrong and what he calls the irreducible sense of wrong, but he does think it's a conceptual truth that if an action is wrong in the irreducible sense, it'll be blameworthy, lacking excuse. But if you think that, then there are going to be certain pressures moving you in the direction of rule utilitarianism as opposed to act utilitarianism for a reason I'll mention in a moment. Okay. So here's one obvious reason. I mean, so we could just again stipulate that it's irrational to prefer that fewer lives be saved, but also think at the same time that individuals have rights not to be harmed, for example, to be killed or to be raped, and to think they have a right not to be harmed, even if that their being harmed would bring about fewer harmings. So if there are such rights, then there will be cases where failing to forbear harming an identified individual will wrong the obligee and be wrong, period, even if the harm would create less harm or less harming overall. But what about cases where it's not about harm, but about a choice between saving or otherwise benefiting some individual and saving more lives or creating more benefit overall, where no rights are involved? So if we've got a right involved, we've got a bipolar obligation or relational duty, and the right will involve the authority to demand something, and it'll entail the wrongness of that not being provided, other things being equal. But what if there is no right involved? Well, again, even if the greater overall benefit is more desirable, it's still consistent with this desirability claim that it would be permissible, indeed that it would be wrong not to save or benefit some, though this requires less benefit, saving fewer lives overall. Now, on a second personal approach, we've got the idea that, again, what it is for an action to be wrong is for it to be blameworthy, lacking excuse. And we begin with the Rawlsian premise that each person is a source of valid claims. As I put it, we all have an equal basic second personal authority to make claims and demands of one another at all. And then the substantive normative question is, well, what claims do we have the authority to make of one another? And we work that out in a contractualist fashion, because the way to think about contractualism is just that it's based in that thought. It's based in the thought that what matters for obligation is the claims that we have the authority to make of one another. And we could grant, for purposes of argument, that every person has some claim to what will promote his or her good. So there's a way of sort of getting back into utilitarianism or consequentialism from a contractualist framework, as those of you who know Harsanyi's work and Rawls's reference to Harsanyi in Theory of Justice will know. But if wrong is analytically related to accountability, then an action will be wrong only if there would be reason to hold agents accountable for performing it and to blame them were they to perform it without excuse. And since accountability, here's the crucial point, since accountability is intrinsically public or quasi-public in its nature, that is, it's essentially an interpersonal matter, so I can only hold you accountable for something if I think that you would appropriately hold yourself accountable for it. So there's got to be some kind of mutual accessibility. There's got to be the possibility of reciprocal recognition on the standards to which we're holding ourselves mutually accountable. Then we should believe an action wrong only if we think it's of a kind that should be publicly condemned and agents who perform it held accountable. So that's the crucial thing that moves you from act consequentialism to rule consequentialism. If you're if you're inclined to think that everybody has an equal claim to their own good. The question really is, when we're talking about what's morally right or what's morally wrong, what are we prepared to hold people accountable for? And that's a matter of what would we want our public understanding to which we hold ourselves, even what's grounding it, or considerations of the good. So even if we begin with the premise that every person has an equal claim to the promotion of his good, this would tend not to support AU, act utilitarianism, would tend to support rule utilitarianism. And then we get back into the territory of arguments that Norm Daniels has reminded us of from Alan Gibbard and so on about, well, what we'd have to give up in terms of personal relationships and our humanity if we were to blind ourselves to the situation of the particular others to whom we are related in various ways. I just want to end with 2 points, 2 reasons, further reasons a second personal approach would provide space for benefiting or saving identified individuals. One is that what the view is focused on is not so much, and this is part of what Arthur was saying, not just all of us as patients, but all of us as agents who are living with one another on terms of mutual accountability. So what we're interested in is not so much welfare per se, but people's flourishing as such beings, as independent, mutually accountable beings. And so there it matters what people's own will is and what they consent to, not just what would actually benefit them. The second thing is that what we might think of as the independent significance of second personal responsiveness. So Norman talked about Alan Gibbard's reference to we might lose our humanity if we blinded ourselves to the needs of people before our eyes in whose presence we are. Well, the point is not just that we might fail to respond to things about them that are important. If we fail to respond to their pleas, if we didn't make ourselves accountable to them, then we'd lose, as it were, the coin of morality. We'd lose the coin of mutual responsiveness and mutual accountability. Now, I don't think that's completely dispositive, and there are lots of things one could say back on the other side, but I think this would be relevant. So just in conclusion, we can think there's a kind of bias in preferring impartially that some identified individuals be benefited or saved at greater cost overall without thinking that it's wrong to act on this preference. Moreover, there are reasons, even on a consequentialist approach, to think that it's sometimes wrong not to do so. Thank you very much.
Caspar Hare is Associate Professor of Philosophy at MIT. He's consistently published highly original and very sharp contributions on issues in practical rationality, metaphysics, and normative ethics, and the connections between them. 10 days ago, the New England Consequentialism Workshop, which meets at the Safra Center, has held a seminar to discuss parts of his forthcoming and incredibly interesting, I found, book manuscript, The Limits of Kindness, which is coming out very soon. That book connects these 3 issues and grounds an approach to ethics in considerations about practical rationality and personal identity, so stay tuned. I'll mention also that Caspar's papers published in the very best philosophy venues tend to have fun titles. So consider Take the Sugar, consider The Ethics of Morphine, and the title of his previous book, On Myself and Other Less Important Subjects. So I cut this short. Please join me in welcoming Caspar to speak.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think I'll walk about, in part because you must all be completely exhausted. I'm really happy to be here. And, okay, what am I going to talk about? So Nia gave me this brief, which was to say what a consequentialist would say about our obligation to identified people versus our obligation to merely statistical people. This seemed to me like a very interesting but very, very broad question. So at least for the first half of the talk, how long do I have? Half an hour, 25 minutes? 20, whatever. Anyway, okay. First half of the talk, however long it turns out to be, I'm going to try to narrow down the question. And in the process of doing that, I'll ignore lots of other questions that are really interesting and that could have been the subjects of other talks, but they're not. Okay. So first attempt to narrow it down. How consequentialist thinks about obligations to people. Well, let's just suppose that we're in a situation where we have the opportunity to benefit the identified particular person, and we have the opportunity to benefit a merely statistical person. And the question is, what ought we to do? Okay, that's one way of understanding this question of what our obligations are. Is there any reason to think that we ought to benefit the particular person, the identified person, rather than the merely statistical person? Second thing we need to do in order to narrow down the question is to explain what on earth we mean by identified person and merely statistical person. So philosophers have this way of taking things that weren't meant literally, and expressing complete bemusement. And so this irritates their spouses tremendously if their spouses are non-philosophers. And like 9 times out of 10, it is just a pedantic conversational trope. 1 time out of 10, it's really useful, you know, and you actually find something. So we'll see whether this turns out to be really useful. What is a merely statistical person? I mean, what is that? Is that somebody who's like composed of information? Or is it like somebody with 1.8 children? There are no merely statistical people, right? They're just people. I don't see any merely statistical people. I've never heard of a merely statistical person. Anyway, okay, so what do we mean? Well, there are lots of things that we might mean when we talk of benefiting merely statistical people. You can look at your handout now. It may be first that the distinction between the identified and the merely statistical person has to do with what I know. So maybe I know a great deal about the one person, the identified person, and I know very little about the merely statistical person. So it could be that I know the one person's name is James, I know that he works at Best Buy, I know date of birth, I know his interests, his hobbies, and so forth, and I don't know anything about the other person. That's one thing we might mean. We also might mean, again, harping on this idea that the difference has to do with what we know. Maybe I know a great deal about the way in which I'll help the identified person if I'm going to help the identified person, and I don't know very much about the way I'd help the merely statistical person if I were to help the merely statistical person. So maybe I know that, again, to use the famous example, maybe I know that the identified person is in a well, right, and the rescuers are digging down to save him, so I know that maybe I can contribute to the rescue effort, so I know that the way I'll help that person is by, I don't know what, adding fuel to the machine that's going to dig the tunnel that will save him, right? Whereas I don't know anything about how I'm going to help the merely statistical person, I just know that I'm going to help him some way. Again, I don't know, in these well cases, that's enough to engage effective responses in a big scale way. All we need to know is that there's a boy in the well, right? And that the rescuers are digging down to save him. We don't need to know the boy's name. We don't need to know, I mean, usually hear where he was from. But just hearing that he's in the well, the basics of his condition and what's threatening him is usually enough to engage our effective identified person bias. Okay, it could be that maybe I know, I don't know more about the identified person than I know about the merely statistical person, but maybe I'm in a position to know more. Or it could be that I know on the one hand that if I do this, I'll benefit one person, and I know that if I do this other thing, that will have an expected benefit to one person. But it might help nobody, and it might help many people. So this is something like, you know, on the one hand I can benefit the one person, on the one hand, on the other hand, I can do something such that if I do it, there's a 1 in 100 chance I'll benefit 100 people, and a 99 out of 100 chance that I'll benefit nobody, right? The expected benefit there is to one person. These are all interesting things that one could talk about. I'm not going to talk about any of them. Okay, I'm going to talk not about these cases where what's the way in which I'll benefit the merely statistical person is subjectively chancy, when it's down to ignorance on my part, but where it's objectively chancy in a certain kind of way. And again, people, when they talk about objective chance, philosophers, when they talk about objective chance, mean very, very many different kinds of things. I'm going to mean a very particular thing. I'm going to mean, I'm going to be looking at cases where if I benefit the merely statistical person, I do so by means of a process that is counterfactually open. And we can explain now what I mean by counterfactually open. Again, look at your handout. So, we say that a process is counterfactually open when, supposing that it doesn't take place, there is no fact of the matter about what its outcome would have been if it had taken place. So, I have a coin. I could flip it now onto the floor, right? I'm choosing not to do it. I'm putting it back in my pocket. Okay. Coin flips are counterfactually open. What does that mean? That means that, given that I didn't flip the coin, that's something that I didn't flip the coin. If I had flipped the coin, I would have gotten a head or a tail. That's true. But it's not the case that if I'd flipped the coin, I would have gotten a head, and it's not the case that if I'd flipped the coin, I would have gotten a tail. Neither of those is determinately true. Now, there's some argument that philosophers have who think about this. There are two ways of thinking about it. There's the Lewisian school of thinking about counterfactuals, according to which it's determinately false that if I'd flipped the coin, I would have gotten a head, and it's determinately false that if I'd flipped the coin, I would have gotten a tail. And there's the Stolnakerian theory of counterfactuals, which has it that it's indeterminately whether, the claim that if I'd flipped the coin, I would have gotten a head has indeterminate truth value, and the claim that if I'd flipped the coin, I would have gotten a tail has indeterminate truth value. It's not going to matter for these purposes which of these views of counterfactuals we go in for. I favor the Lewis view. I can talk about that later, but I don't think it's going to matter for anything we say as we move forward here. Okay, so many processes are counterfactually open. And notice that for a process to be counterfactually open, it doesn't need to be governed by indeterministic laws. Even if the coin flip, the laws of our world are Newtonian, right? It's still true that there's no fact of the matter about what would have happened if I'd flipped the coin. It may be true that if I'd flipped it with, if I'd given 6.843 newtons of impulse to the coin at precisely this angle, right, in virtue of the laws of the universe being deterministic, it would have landed heads, right? That may be true. Counterfactuals like that with extremely precise antecedents may be determinate. But counterfactuals with much less precise antecedents, like if I'd flipped the coin, the antecedent is not precise enough to pick out the consequent. Put that loosely. Okay. Okay, so lots of processes, even in Newtonian deterministic worlds, are counterfactually open. Coins, rolling dice, spinning roulette wheels, and so forth. Okay, now I want you to focus on two kinds of cases that involve these kinds of counterfactually open processes. On your handout, case one. Archie, Bill, Cynthia, Dora, and Edith are in danger. If I do nothing, then Archie will die and one of the others will die. And a counterfactually open process will determine which one. Now, I thought about adding embellishments as people do involving roulette wheels and dice and so forth, but it doesn't matter. Embellish the story. You're tired of that. Embellish the story as you like. If I head north, then I can intervene to prevent Archie from dying. If I head south, then I can intervene to prevent the counterfactually open process from occurring, and thereby prevent any of Bill, Cynthia, Dora, and Edith from dying. Those are my only options. So basically, whatever I do, at least one person's going to die. If I do nothing, Archie's going to die, and one of these others is going to die. If I can prevent Archie from dying, or I can prevent this counterfactually open process from taking place, in which case none of these people are going to die. But, and this is the key thing, there's no fact of the matter as to which one of them would have died had I gone the other route. Okay? All fixed on that? It's important. Okay. Case two. Angie, Belinda, Cyril, Damien, and Edgar are in danger. If I do nothing, then they'll all die. If I head north, then I can intervene to prevent Archie from dying. If I head south, then I can intervene so as to prevent one of the others from dying. A counterfactually open process will determine which one. Again, embellish the story as you like. So the key feature of this case is that whatever happens, at least 5 people are going to die. I can prevent Archie from dying, right? Or I can prevent one of these other ones from dying. But if I prevent Archie from dying, there's no fact of the matter as to who I would have prevented from dying if I prevented one of these others from dying. Okay? Good. Okay, so these kinds of cases are everywhere if you start thinking seriously about the long-term consequences of your actions and the chaos effect, butterfly effects and the like. The sensitivity of later states of the universe to initial states of the universe. Okay, so the issue is there any consequentialist, broadly, justification for thinking that I ought to benefit the identified person, Archie or Angie, in these 2 cases? And again, just narrowing the question down even further, let's suppose that we're not going to look at, you could give some kind of indirect consequentialist justification by looking at policies or by looking at attitudes and then try to explain why we ought to help the identified action, justify that indirectly by way of justifying a policy of helping the identified person in this case, or by way of justifying an action of helping the identified person in this kind of case. That would be some kind of rule utilitarian or motive consequentialist policy. I'm not going to ask that question. I'm going to ask, is there a direct consequentialist justification, or any direct justification at all, for helping Archie and Angie in these kinds of cases? Okay, so halfway through, and that's the question. Okay, and I'm just going to look at 2 possible answers to that question. The first appeals to an equitable distribution of chances. So this isn't really consequentialist, but I just thought I'd put it out there. And one way of thinking, in these cases, is to distribute chances of living in an equitable way. You'll notice that in the first case, this does seem to yield the result that we ought to help Archie. So look at your handout. Chances of living in case 1, if I head north, Archie will have a 100% chance of living, and each of the others will have a 75% chance of living. If I head south, on the other hand, Archie will have no chance of living, and each of the others will have a 100% chance of living. And, at least arguably, the first distribution of chances is more equitable than the second distribution of chances, right? The second distribution of chances involves Archie getting none of the good of a chance of living, right? And the first one involves him getting some of it. And each of the others, we max him in. We're looking at 75 in the first case and 0 in the second case. Okay, but notice that in the second example, that isn't going to justify saving the identified person. Notice that in the second example, if I head north, then Angie has a 100% chance of living, and Belinda to Edgar have 0% chance of living. Whereas if I head south, Angie has no chance of living, and Belinda, Cyril, Damien, and Edgar each have a 25% chance of living. At least arguably, the second distribution is more equitable than the first distribution. So this approach is not going to yield that I ought to help the identified person in all cases. It's going to, in particular, not in the second case. So this approach, for this reason, I don't think the distribute chances equitably approach really can do a very good general job of justifying bias towards particular people, or bias towards identified people. Okay, so what is an alternative? So I'm going to talk about something that was touched on by Michael. This is appealing to a person-affecting anti-aggregative approach. So suppose in case 1 that what I do is I help, I prevent the counterfactually open process from occurring and ensure that none of Bill, Cynthia, Dora, and Edith die. Okay? This is very bad for Andy. How is it for each of Bill, Cynthia, Dora, and Edith? Well, you might say, well, let's focus on Bill. How is it for him? Well, first thing you might say is we don't really know whether that was good or bad for Bill, because that depends on whether he would have died if I'd done the other thing. And all we can say is that there's no fact of the matter as to whether he would have died if I'd headed north, if I'd done the other thing, right? All we can say is that there was a counterfactual conditional probability of 0.75 that he would have died if I'd done the other thing. So I take it that an action that is an action like that, I take it is quite good for Bill. I think it's rather less good for Bill than if, say, there would have been a counterfactual conditional probability of 0.1 that he would have lived if I'd done the other thing, and rather better for Bill than an action taken in a context in which there would have been a counterfactual conditional probability of 0.999 that he would have lived if I'd done the other thing. It's quite good for Bill. So, and likewise for Cynthia, Dora, and Edith. So if I head south, I will have done something that's very bad for Archie and quite good for Bill, Cynthia, Dora, and Edith. If I head north, on the other hand, I will have done something that's very bad for one person, whichever one turns out to be the one that dies, right? And very good for Archie, because if I hadn't taken it, he would have died for certain. So here's a kind of, I don't know, prima facie plausible anti-aggregationist principle. It's on your handout. Other things being equal, it's better to do something very good for one person and very bad for one person than to do something quite good for 4 people and very bad for one person. That entails that it's better to head north than to head south. Basically, if I head south, there's nobody who I really helped. And there's somebody I really hurt. And if I head north, there's somebody I really hurt and somebody I really helped. Right? Sorry, there's somebody I really helped, yeah. Yeah, good. Okay, and similar reasoning works in the other case. So if, suppose in the second case I head north, that's very bad for, that's very good for Angie. She'd have died otherwise. It's quite bad for Belinda, Cyril, Damien, and Edgar. Focus on Belinda. It's quite bad for her, because if I'd headed south, there would have been a counterfactual conditional probability of 0.25 that she'd have lived. It's quite bad, not terrible. It would have been worse had I headed south, there would have been a counterfactual conditional probability of 0.999 that she would have lived. Better had I headed south, there would have been a counterfactual conditional probability of 0.01 if she'd lived, of her living. Okay, so, and again, we can then just apply the principle that says, other things being equal, it's better to do something that's very good for one person and quite bad for 4 people than to do something that's very good for one person and very bad for one person. Now, you might, in light of what Michael said, you might say, hey, well, wait a second. Let's focus, in this latter case, let's focus on the person who would have, suppose I head north, right? And I save the identified person. And we look at all those other people. For each of them, there's a 0.25 counterfactual conditional probability that they would have been saved if I headed south. But what's certain is that somebody would have been saved if I'd headed south. So can we not say, well, focus on that somebody, that person. For that person, my action was very, very, very bad. But there is no such person. And that's the key insight. That such person does not exist. I'm going to say it loudly to make it really. There is no such person. This is where the philosophers like blank stare at the idea of a merely statistical person gets some weight. It's easy to think that there's such a person, but that's because one might think that from if I do this, then somebody will be benefited, it follows that there's somebody such that if I do this, then he or she will be benefited. You might think that, but that just doesn't follow in cases where counterfactuals are open. It's just a fallacy. So if we just focus on the individuals, it turns out that we haven't seriously hurt it. We didn't do anything very bad for anybody by helping the identified person. Okay. Of course, this focuses on individuals and not states of affairs. This is not a very consequentialist justification for the action, because the consequentialism, the idea is that you focus on the goodness and badness of states of affairs first and foremost, right? We don't look at whether actions are good or bad for individuals. We look at whether states of affairs are good or bad. And the consequentialist is going to say, well, supposing I head north, right? Then we evaluate, we compare the outcome of my heading north with the outcome of my heading south. The outcome of my heading north is a single world, right, in which Angie lives and everybody else dies. The outcome of my heading south, that's a space of worlds, right, presumably, in a quarter of which Belinda dies, a quarter of which Cyril dies, a quarter of which Damien dies, and a quarter of which Edgar dies. The consequentialist is going to say, well, if we want to compare these outcomes, one outcome, a single world, to another outcome, a space of worlds, we have to attribute values to the outcomes, each of these outcomes in the space of worlds, and multiply them by a quarter and compare, and you're not going to get a difference in value ascribed to the outcomes. So this is not a consequentialist in the sense that it focuses on the goodness and badness of outcomes first and then justifies actions in terms of whether or not they have good outcomes or better outcomes. Nonetheless, it's broadly consequentialist in the sense that you look at the effects on people and you justify, this is a semantic issue, you can quibble about this, but you justify actions by whether or not they had good or bad effects on people. And the point would be that in helping the identified person, we don't do anything that's very bad for anybody. Okay, so that was the best I could do by way of trying to generate a first-order justification for helping identified people in these kinds of cases.
Thank you very much. So thanks for helping this group of identified people. And our last speaker is Michael Slote. In contemporary philosophy, perhaps the first name that comes to mind when you think about a core virtue ethicist. He's the UST professor of ethics at the University of Miami. Slote has grounded virtue ethics in a sentimentalist framework and offered specific analysis of virtues such as empathy and compassion that seem especially relevant to our discussions of the identified victim bias. Slote has many articles and books. The most recent books are Moral Sentimentalism and The Impossibility of Perfection, Aristotle, Feminism, and the Complexities of Ethics. He also has a forthcoming volume, Education and Human Values, Reconciling Talent with an Ethics of Care. First heard Professor Slote speak in Oxford around 2002 on the closely related question of the legitimacy of prioritizing the near and dear for aid. We are looking forward to hearing him shed light on the legitimacy of the identified victim bias from his virtue ethics sentimentalist perspective.
Thank you, Nir, and let me add my voice to Steve Darwall's in thanking the hosts, the organizers of this wonderful conference. I think one thing, I hope, that we all did agree about was that there is this tendency, this human tendency, to prefer as what's called the identified potential victim as opposed to statistical or even anonymous ones. What we disagree about is whether this has moral significance, and if it does, under what kind of theory we should explain the moral significance. I'm going to argue that it doesn't have an indirect, but rather a kind of direct and immediate moral significance. And I'm going to base that on the notion of empathy. I think that empathy is involved in our having moral concepts and in the moral concepts themselves. And that's going to make a difference to whether there's a moral justification for the kind of situation we're talking about, where clearly empathy or sympathy has some role to play. Just very superficially, but to put us all on the same page, empathy is Bill Clinton's "I feel your pain." There are variations on this. Sympathy, very roughly, is when you feel sorry for someone who's in pain and want them to be helped or want to help them, something like that. So why do I think that empathy is involved in our moral concepts or having moral concepts? I'm going to give you some reasons. First, there's the fact that we do tend to feel, let's say, more empathy for those who are near and dear to us than for strangers, and to also think that we have more of a stronger obligation to the near and dear than to the strangers. So the moral thought seems to follow empathic tendencies in this case. What goes more against empathy, namely not helping your near and dear, forgetting the fact if you hate your father or mother, but other things being equal, that seems also to be considered by us to be morally worse. One explanation of that, a rather salient one, would be that the reason why these things follow each other, in this case and perhaps others, is that empathy is involved in the very concept of calling something morally better, worse, right, or wrong. But this also applies not just in families, but to a case which is not statistical versus identified, but the familiar and famous Peter Singer type case where you can, you have a child drowning right in front of you, you can easily save, right? You perceive the danger, as opposed to danger or disaster that you merely know about and that you can prevent by, let's say, sending a check to Oxfam. Now, Singer, of course, famously argued that there's no difference between those two cases. And I certainly think that most of us, or more of us, should be giving money to Oxfam than we do. However, I think we'd consider it morally monstrous for the person not to save the child drowning right in front of them. And we wouldn't make that kind of judgment about not saving. Maybe Singer would, but I don't think most of us would make that kind of judgment about not sending the money to Oxfam. So I think there's a comparative difference, and again, it follows empathy. The psychologists tell us that we are more empathic vis-a-vis what we perceive than what we merely know about. Acquaintance versus description is another way of describing that. So again, why does empathy dictate, or why does moral judgment seem to follow empathic responses? Well, an explanation would be that the empathy is part of the moral judgments. It's built into them. I'm going to say more about how. But look, there's a third consideration, and this has to do with moral education or moral development. There are a number of theories of moral development. And, I mean, probably the best known is the Kantian Rawlsian one, though Rawls had his own, but the one that Lawrence Kohlberg offered. It was based on Piaget, had different levels and stages. Basically, cognitive sophistication increased, in his studies. The problem was, and this is something he himself recognized at the end of his life, is that moral sophistication, in terms of articulating principles, doesn't equate, or even necessarily that well correlate, with moral motivation. And toward the end of his life, he brought in empathy. He started talking about empathic considerations. Well, I think he was probably right to do that. I think the cognitivist approach is problematic. And so I think empathy is an easier thing to make reference to if you're going to explain changing and improving moral motivation. So let me just make reference to a couple of places in the literature. Martin Hoffman talks about making use of our capacity or tendency for empathy. He calls it inductive discipline or induction. If a child, your child, hurts another child, little Billy, and rather than let your child go running off, assuming you have a good relationship and you're not threatening your child, you say, look what you did. Think how he must be feeling. Remember what happened to you last week. Now, Hoffman thinks if you get the child to sort of see things, feel things from the other person's perspective. And they have a capacity to do that. This will make them feel bad about what they've done. You don't have to mention moral concepts, just the harm or hurt that you've caused. Hoffman thinks that if you do this a few times, there will start to be an inhibition, a reluctance to do that sort of thing. And that's a moral improvement, okay? Though Hoffman doesn't mention it, Nancy Eisenberg, in her The Caring Child, talks about how we also learn by modeling, the parent modeling certain kind of attitude. Now think about the inductive parent. They are concerned about that other child, not just about their own child, and they want their child to be concerned too. That attitude is something that the child can imbibe almost osmotically and unconsciously. I mean, this is Hume. We imbibe the attitudes, beliefs of others. And I think this can happen in this case, and Eisenberg doesn't talk about Hume so much, but so I think this is a form of empathy. Hume called it sympathy, but of contagion, basically. So if you're around parents, who are caring and who practice induction and all, you can pick up their concern. So you have two bases for moral improvement here. I think this gives us a clearer picture of moral improvement than other theories. Now let me just mention that those who talk about moral development using empathy contrast this with what they call, or what's called, power assertion, where the parent threatens the child or punishes the child or withholds love or whatever it is. There's evidence that that's less effective in changing a child's motivation than induction and modeling. So that's a background to what I'm going to say next about Aristotelianism and present-day character education as forms of moral development and moral education. Character education does sometimes rely on empathy. But as Aristotelian, there is also an emphasis on habituation. Now, there's a problem with that. It's not clear how habituation changes motivation, especially if it's through your parents' power assertion. They make you take the piano lessons every day, and are you going to? Well, if you're good at it, okay, fine. But they make you study math this or math that. Is this going to develop a love for mathematics? The sheer habituation of the thing. We need some psychological studies, more than have been done, about the effectiveness of this sort of thing. But Hartshorne and May in the 1920s and 30s argued that this kind of repetition kind of thing is not particularly effective. So again, I say, empathy seems to be the best engine we've got, and if moral concepts and moral thinking, work in terms of empathy, that would make it something we could hope for, then more easily hope for, that people could morally improve. Morally improve because their empathy is improving, and we understand a bit how that can occur. Now, my final reason, and probably my most complicated reason, for thinking that empathy is involved in moral concepts has to do with a case that Charles Fried describes, not the one, anything in the 1969 article, but rather his 1970 book, An Anatomy of Values. In that, he describes, we would say presciently, but it was old hat even then, the case of miners trapped underground. And what he says is that, we know there's this appeal of the miners trapped underground, but we should resist that. If there's a choice between using the money we've raised, or that we have, to save them, or to invest in equipment that will save more miners in the future. Now, I'm not talking about 10 times as many miners, just more miners. That's enough, according to Fried. Fried goes one step further. He says that once we've made and we realize the force and validity of that decision, then if there's some way of going down into the mine, not that allows us to save the miners, but that allows us to go down there and face them across whatever barrier makes their rescue impossible, we should be willing to tell them that we've decided not to save them because we want to save more lives in the future. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that chilling, okay? And I think more generally, there's something a little bit chilling about what are, after all, sometimes described as cold utilitarian calculations, okay? So I'm going to argue that we have the two things you can say about the utilitarian choice here. One, we have a tendency to save the miners rather than do the utilitarian thing. But also we have this element of chill. Now, you might say, oh, what is this? That's just a psychology, right? But I want to argue that that actually is part of the constitution of our concept of right and wrong, or at least of wrong. So let me talk in the sentimentalist fashion, and virtue ethical too, about what I think here. I think that Hume was right, that we should understand notions of approval and disapproval in very primitive sentimentalist terms that don't beg any issues, okay? Not the way Price argued that they beg the issue, because you can't approve without thinking it's right. But there's something very elemental about approval and disapproval, as I shall indicate, and that we can define moral terms and statements and concepts in those terms. Now, Hume himself had the idea that we use pleasure and pain. The pain that we see another likely cause or actually cause a third party as the pain we feel upon empathically receiving that pain that they've caused or likely to cause. That's our basic disapproval. And for approval, it's the pleasure we feel when somebody accords or gives someone pleasure. There are lots of reasons for not going along with that. I'm just going to assume that we're not going to go along with that at this moment. Because actually, I think Hume has a better theory. He doesn't recognize it as a separate theory as far as I know. But it seems to me that an incipient better theory occurs, page 604 and 605 of Selby Big of the treatise, where he talks about how we are warmed by the warm actions of one friend in helping another. Warmed by their warmth. That's empathy. In effect, it's empathy with empathy. Okay? Hume doesn't say this, but I think that's a form of approval, a kind of basic sentimental form of approval. And by the same token, and opposed to that, I think the chill that we feel in response to certain people's attitudes and stuff, the utilitarians may chill me slightly, but of course, the really cold-hearted types who don't care about anyone, that's where you really get the chills, right? The serial killer. Okay, so I think that chill, in one degree or another, is a form of disapproval, okay? Now, that goes against a tendency of some to say, oh, no, disapproval should be seen as anger at what someone has done. I think there's a problem with that. First of all, it's not at all clear how to pair anger with some other attitude as positive and negative, whereas if you have chill and warmth, you do have natural opposites, and Hume had pleasure and pain. It's not clear what to pair with anger. But I think there's a kind of deeper point. Disapproval is not a hot attitude. We don't have the phrase in English, hot disapproval, but anger is hot. So I think when somebody does something wrong, we can get angry with them, absolutely. But I think at that point we aren't actually disapproving, because we're not distant enough to be disapproving. So, but you can say, oh yeah, well, anger is one form of disapproval, and your chill reaction is another. I'm all right with that. I'm just telling you why I prefer the chill reaction. And the chill reaction, I think, allows one to define moral concepts, or at least the concept of wrong, and the warmth to define the concept of right. So what I said in the book, Moral Sentimentalism, is that, let's say, the warm reaction, okay, fixes the reference of a term like morally good, or maybe even morally right, but morally good, okay, and that the chill reaction fixes the reference, okay. In something like the way Kripke talks about the sensation of red fixing the reference of objective redness. Objective redness is what, in many cases, right, causes the sensation of red for Kripke, with certain variations which are rather important. It's not fully Kripkean, but nonetheless, I do try to preserve the objectivity of moral judgments in the way that Kripke sought to preserve the objectivity of judgments of red or of tiger or whatever. So similarly, the warm approval, okay, that I feel, that fixes the reference of the notion of goodness. Goodness is, so to speak, what explains it. It explains our feelings of warmth. It's something in the object, but in this case, the object is a human being who himself or herself has attitudes of warm concern or other things. Now, if you have a theory like this, Okay, and the same would go for chill and disapproval. In other words, moral badness is what in the object tends to explain this kind of thing. But that's not a definition. That's a reference-fixing use. Okay, any more than Kripke thought he had a definition of redness as what explains. I mean, he had all kinds of modal intuitions that explain why that's not a definition. Okay, so now this allows one to have an objective theory. I mean, sentimentalism has a problem vis-a-vis Kantianism. Kantianism seems to allow for more objectivity of moral judgments than sentimentalism ever has. And I think that's a nice feature of Kantian approaches, and maybe Aristotelian too. And even the most objectiveness-seeking version of Humean sentimentalism, namely the ideal observer theory, still makes things relative to human nature, okay, and to the attitudes of observers, okay? But if you take a Kripkean or semi-Kripkean approach, you don't make the judgments relative to the attitudes of human observers. And it makes it, I think, fully objective in any sense that we could want for the notion of objectivity. Now, there's another feature of this, which I think is sort of interesting. Just as Kripke implied or seemed to think that if you don't have the sensation of red ever, you're not going to fully understand the word red or yellow or whatever. So similarly, I think if you don't ever feel warmth or chill, and who is not going to feel warmth at the warmth or chill at the cold-heartedness of someone? Well, let's say a psychopath, certain kinds, very typical psychopath. That person, okay, on this view, is not actually capable of full moral thinking, okay? Now, you have to spell out more, what are the conditions under which children have full moral thinking. It's not enough that the child, feel bad about hurting little Billy. They have to have a sense of the larger community, and there's a whole description in the literature. It's not just Martha Nussbaum, but it's also Martin Hoffman talking about how we expand our empathic horizons, and I think that's part of moral learning and moral education too. And I think unless you've expanded them a little bit, see, adolescents, for the first time, are capable of empathizing with larger groups of unknown, the starving people of X or the oppressed people of Y. Pre-adolescents too, but usually, it's on 12, 13, 14. I think until you've got that, you probably don't have full moral concepts. So that's part of what I'm saying. So to go back now to the utilitarian solution, so to speak, to the case of the minors, okay. I do think that chill is representative of a moral reason because it's built into the concept of morality. That what is, okay, I'm not sure it's built into the concept, but it's, I think, a basic normative truth that follows out of all of this. That what is lacking in empathic, if an action or an attitude is lacking in empathic concern for others, okay, then it's wrong or it's bad, morally. Okay. By that token, it seems to me that the utilitarian attitude is lacking. That Freed's attitude, for example, is lacking in empathic concern. And to that extent, therefore, I think we can say it's wrong. And I think the chill, okay, therefore has moral significance because it ties to the very concept we're talking about. Chill is evidence of coldness. Coldness is a lack of empathic, agential coldness is a lack of empathic concern for others, and that, on my view, is wrong. Now, one problem with what I've just been saying is it holds in abeyance all issues about deontology and justice, okay? I mean, I was talking about a certain correlation. You might say, oh yeah, but how does empathy correlate with anything having to do, how does empathy correlate with anything having to do with deontology, okay? In the book, Moral Sentimentalism, in fact, until I thought there was some plausible thing a sentimentalist could say about deontology, I wasn't going off in this direction. Because I'm convinced by Shelley Kagan, as against Sam Scheffler, that there's no partiality without deontology. I call that Kagan's theorem. In other words, Kagan gave all kinds of cases where if you're partial and you don't have deontology, you get incredibly bad moral results. Scheffler argued against them in Human Morality, but I don't think Scheffler's arguments really win the day. And so I worry about that. I don't think you can be a partialist like me and not have some kind of deontology. So it's when I thought, look, there's an analogy between let's say in the case of perception, we perceive as opposed to merely knowing about something, that the different way that empathy is elicited. I think empathy is differentially elicited in terms of whether our action is going to cause somebody harm or merely allow someone harm. I think empathy flinches from causing in a way it doesn't flinch from allowing. So when I thought that, or realized that, or believed I realized that, then I thought, okay, so we understand deontology in sentimentalist terms. And I think that's an interesting possibility that really has to be considered. So then of course there are issues of justice. I don't have time here now. I really don't have the time to talk about those issues of justice. But I actually think that an approach that emphasizes empathy is going to espouse different views of justice and respect and rights from those that Kantians and rationalists are going to espouse. So I think the real task and burden for the sentimentalist like myself is to show normatively, is to really argue normatively, that the sentimentalist, the empathy emphasizing type, gets the normative view right about the cases where Kantians and rationalists would disagree. But as I say, that's for another occasion. Thank you.